After several delays, Somalia has finally set a date for the presidential elections. MPs from the country's upper and lower houses of parliament will choose the next president on the 15th of this month. President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo is seeking a second term but faces stiff competition from several candidates, including two former presidents. The election was postponed by more than a year because of a power struggle between Farmajo and the Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble. The timing of the vote ensures Somalia does not miss out on a $400 million financial package from the IMF. Now, it is set to expire unless a new administration is in place by May 17. And political analyst Dr. Hassan Khannenje is the director of the Horn International Institute of Strategic Studies in Nairobi, Kenya. He joins us now to talk more about this. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Khannenje. Obviously, a significant announcement that Somalia's parliament has made on the date of the presidential election. But as I mentioned there, that it was in danger of losing that huge grant loan from the IMF. The question then becomes, was it an unwitting decision, as in all the issues that were considered contentious, were they adequately dealt with?
I think there are still a lot of issues, yet to be addressed. But I think the prospect of losing enormous financial help, especially from the IMF as well as other, donors and Somali partners, has pushed the parties into an agreement to actually set a date and make it certain that Somalia is going to have a president in the next 2 weeks. And so a combination of both domestic, economic, as well as international pressure in terms of factors have, I think, come together to ensure that the leading parties and players in Somalia come to some kind of an arrangement where they can see through this transition process.
I mean, we'll take a look at the presidential election in just a moment, but as we mentioned, the appointment of the parliamentarians, that took a long time. It was delayed because of contestations and even questions around the voting model. Let's look at who voted for these 270 legislators. As in, was it an evil spread in terms of the clans or the so-called warlords that are themselves at the forefront of the political contestations? The civil society organizations, did they have enough time and access to be able to ensure that those people that they want to put in power are there?
The Somali process or system of election is rather different from what is practiced in most democratic societies, including in African countries. And so the current system, which was, of course, adopted after the universal suffrage idea was shut down, involves elders who determine the number of delegates who are going to elect MPs. So there are about 14,000 delegates who elect in turn about 275 members of parliament and then 54 senators. Now, these parliamentarians are the ones who are going to determine who becomes the president, and then the president will appoint the prime minister will form the government. So it's not exactly the kind of system where you're going to have extensive involvement of civil society, where individuals are going to be able to vote for their leaders. And it is a system that, of course, goes back to what has been practiced traditionally previously, where clan elders seems to hold sway. And of course, until we get to a point where there's universal suffrage, we cannot exactly discuss the Somali system as democratic at this point.
So having said that, for the presidential election, then who will elect whom or what? I believe that there are 329 lawmakers. Will it be from both houses?
Yes, and whoever is going to get 50 plus 1, which is about, I think, 165 votes, of course, is going to carry the day. Now, as a tradition and a practice in Somalia, it's unlikely that the candidate who is going to match the president is going to be able to get this in the first round. So a chance is good. What we expect is after the first round, the leading candidates, or at least the two leading candidates, are likely to form coalitions to be able to mobilize their votes and bring them together to bear in order to win the presidency. But right now, the way things stand, of course, there are a number of front runners, but there is no clear favorite to win this coming election in about 10 days.
So let's talk about the front runners. I mentioned earlier on President Farmajo and his former Prime Minister, the entanglement or the, arguments between them. How has that seeped into the body politic of Somalia, and how this presidential election will unfold?
The current tussle between the Prime Minister and the President, of course, has led to some of these delays and dysfunction within the Somali government, in part because this was a forced marriage, for President Farmajo, in which pretty much he had to yield to international and regional pressure to appoint a prime minister. And this is continuing to be reflected in the contestation that's going on. And of course, some of the front runners, some of them have been presidents before. One has been a prime minister, Haire. One is a president of a member state, Deni. And of course, Farmajo, who is an incumbent, president, at the moment. And so there is a lot of clan trading. There's a lot of clan contestations at the same time. And so depending on what pact is going to be established with sufficient guarantees, we're likely, of course, to see the strongest candidate from a combination of clans, come to fore. But what has been a tradition is Somalia in recent years has not elected a president to more than one term. And then that of course, works against the incumbent president's ability to be able to win re-election.
I mean, over the years, the political settlements that have been reached at one point or the other for Somalia has always been in a bid to be inclusive. While at the end of regional interventions to ensure this, there's always somebody who feels that they've been left out of the process. And we spoke about the arguments over the voting model. I'm just thinking, can the parliamentarians be up to the task to ensure that issues of the past don't seep in? And as you say, there would be compromises that are made, but would they satisfy what is considered a free and fair process?
It's unlikely. Remember, politicians pursue political interests, mostly which are personal, and none exemplifies this better than actually Somali politicians. A lot of time, they rarely vote for national good. There could be a few who may be nationalist in orientation, but generally a great majority respond to their own, personal interests, personal desires. And so what we're likely to see is not exactly an attempt to avoid the past, but I think an attempt to be able to reestablish some kind of stability that is going to ensure that Somalia gets back in the international community's favor, and that it can stay on the trajectory, on the positive trajectory, so it can continue receiving funding as well as financial help. Because in the absence of this international support, the government lacks the capacity both to maintain the law and order within the country, to run the economy, not to be able to actually function as a viable government within the international system.
Perhaps to reflect on the past a little, to understand better how we got to the presidential election date will coincide with a historic day as the country commemorates the 79th anniversary of the Somali Youth League, formed in 1943. Let's look at the significance of this day, the background to it, and how it sets Somalia on the current course that it's on.
Yeah, the Somali Youth League is, like many of those founding political parties for the fought for independence in Africa, much like what the ANC or SWAPO or KANU in Kenya, for instance, those were founding parties of these republics. And it was able, of course, it has roots in the 1940s fighting against colonialism, but at the same time, it was one party that inspired a sense of hope and a sense of nationalism it created the concept of Greater Somalia and played an instrumental role in the initial governance structures and parliament of Somalia. But of course, with the subsequent coups and dictatorships, the dream that I think it had inspired of Greater Somalia, which of course included an aspiration to unite Somalis, including those who are in the Ogaden in Ethiopia, as well as the Northern Frontier District in Kenya, dissipated. And it's unlikely that we're going to go back to that. And so while this one is more sentimental and is romanticized within the Somali national politics, it's only coincidental it's happening at the time when you're having an election, and perhaps it can bring back some level of euphoria. But in terms of its significance itself, in relation to helping Somalis perhaps reach an agreement, perhaps it may not be that much. However, it is notable that is being discussed, that is being noted, and if the leading lights perhaps use that as a way to mobilize and the sense of nationalism, a sense of patriotism, it's just likely that perhaps the leading lights in Ethiopia, in Somalia, are going to reach an arrangement that is going to see a peaceful transition and a new president in the next 2 weeks in Somalia.
All right. So in a word, what would that president need to do, or the values he'd need to espouse, should I say in a sentence rather, to conquer that struggle for a united and independent Somalia?
I think the first agenda for the new president of Somalia will be to seek to unite Somalis. One is to seek to build better relations between the federal government with the member states. Right now has been fractured. Two, to seek both regional African Union as well as international communities' help in building a strong security sector. Is extremely fractured and factionalized, as evidenced by last year's skirmishes, following an attempt to extend the presidential term limits by President Farmajo. Thirdly, he has to embark on economic revival. Right now, the Somali economy does not have the capacity to feed its own people, nor to run its own government. And so being able to revive institutions, as well as reaching out to the international community to bring in more investment in Somalia, I think is going to be critical for a peaceful and prosperous country within the Horn of Africa region.